Thank you. Hi, my name is Gaiman Yee. I'm the Technical Director of the i4energy Center. Welcome to another of our seminar series. Also want to welcome those that are viewing the seminar on the web. Today's speaker is James Sweeney. He is the Director of the Precourt Energy Efficiency Center at Stanford. He's also a Professor of Management, Science, and Engineering, Senior Fellow of the Stanford Institute for Economics. Senior Fellow of the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, Senior Fellow of the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace, Senior Fellow of the Freeman Sparkley Institute for International Studies, and Senior Fellow of the Woods Institute for the Environment. I'm glad he found time to come speak today.
With all those seniors, I'm feeling awful old, though.
He served as chairman of the Stanford Department of Engineering, Economic Systems, and chairman of the Department of Engineering, Economic Systems, and Operations Research. His professional activities focus on economic policy and analysis, particularly in energy, natural resources, and environment. His research includes depletable and renewable resource use, electricity market analysis, environmental economics, global climate change policy, gasoline market dynamics, energy demand, energy price dynamics, automobile market analysis, and housing market dynamics. I hope you can lower my bill one of these days. Anyway, he holds a BS degree from MIT in electrical engineering and a PhD from Stanford University in engineering economic systems. Let's welcome James Sweeney.
Great. Thank you. Yeah. I'm pleased to be here and would like to spend time talking about a group of issues on the demand side of energy markets. And at Stanford, over the years, we've had a lot of energy research, but like so much of the research in the energy area, the focus has been on new energy supplies, how to get wind or solar, or how to drill better for oil, or how to develop nuclear power. And there's been relatively little attention on the issues associated with how we use energy. Now, up at Berkeley here, not only on the campus, but at LBL, Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, you've had a lot of research on energy use on the demand side, but at Stanford we hadn't. And so what my center is about is really tipping the balance a little bit, focusing on the use of energy. But that implies somewhat change of the type of people that are involved in it. My simple model of the faculty and students doing research in energy at Stanford is physicists, engineers, and economists. Now, physicists include, as a subset, chemists, and there is maybe, and some biologists, clearly not a subset of physics. But what it didn't include was social scientists. And yet, if you think about how we use energy, in the U.S. alone, there's over 300 million people are making decisions on how to use energy, and they're not physicists, engineers, or economists. And their motivations may be driven by things other than what's well studied by them. For example, habits, or marketing, or even what they can find in the marketplace. So that sort of implies that you need a broader community. You need people from many of the social sciences. And one of the things about our center that I'm very pleased now is that we have faculty members and graduate students and undergraduates from every school at Stanford except the law school involved in doing work on the demand for energy. That includes education school and business school, and in humanities and sciences, several people in psychology, somebody in symbolic systems, others in computer science, people in education, school, and public health people. So this is meant as an advertisement. I don't know the backgrounds of most of the people here. I know Carl, but I don't know most of the rest of you here. But for those of you with some social science background, I do suggest that there's just tremendous opportunities for joining the community of people who are coming from a more engineering, physical science, or economics background to be thinking on energy use. And I'd like to illustrate some of those things by, I want to go very quickly. Let me ask a question first. How many of you have a lot of background in energy? This is going to influence how quickly I go. Hold your hands if you. Okay. How many of you feel you have virtually no background in energy? Hold up your hands. And how many of you just some background, but interested but not expertise? Okay, and how many of you just didn't put your hands up because it didn't come to more than half the room? So I'll take it that there is a mix. So I'll go really quickly, though, for some of these issues about some of the context. Basically, the reason I believe that I'm interested in energy, and many economists are interested, is that there's a lot of externalities that are associated with the energy choices we make. Externalities, impacts that are not mediated through a market but will have direct consequences. And those direct consequences, for one reason or other, will not be taken account of by the decision maker themselves. So the decision maker is not really responsible for the consequences of their actions. And the three biggies are the environmental protection, the global climate change. More energy we use, the more carbon dioxide is released, and that's global consequences that when we drive our car, we're not having to take into account or bear the consequences of that. International security, anybody that have noticed the things that are going on in the Middle East for the last 30 years involving the United States, understand there's a relationship between oil and security issues and war. Vulnerability of the infrastructure. And then economics, price volatility itself can lead to macroeconomic dislocations. And those are all things that get worse the more energy we use. So there's a classic externality, so that even if everybody worked perfectly, the system would use too much energy. And therefore you'd have an reason for market intervention. What I want to focus on today, though, mostly, is the body of evidence and the body of information that people aren't optimizing perfectly, at least in the abstract way that economists talk about as they examine the energy system or examine markets. And I'm an economist. I actually come from a neoclassical tradition, so that this is issues associated with how the behavioral economists and many of the other social scientists are observing the type of behaviors we get. But I want to start with a few data. First, carbon dioxide emissions. The biggest thing is coal and electric generation. Next is transportation. The direct use of energy in residential and commercial looks small. These data are perfectly right, perfectly misleading. Because the way we release electricity, the way we release carbon dioxide in our residential and our commercial activities is through electricity. And the only reason we generate this electricity is so we can use it in these other three sectors. So if you take the carbon dioxide released from this electricity and distribute it, the data in proportion to the electricity used, it looks like this. where the yellow is the amount of carbon dioxide we release through residential, commercial, and industrial activities through using electricity, which in itself releases carbon dioxide. So the thing I want you to get from this is, one, there's one set of issues, which is transportation and oil, mostly oil. The red's oil and transportation. It's about all we do use as energy there. And the second big issue is how we use electricity. And then the third, of course, is how we generate the electricity, but I want to focus on the use side. And those emissions that we can look at, a lot of people talk about is in buildings. You can think of this as mostly buildings. But want to and then you can then again look at this area. One way, and you've heard this data often, that 40% of our carbon emissions is because of the buildings. And therefore, we've got to fix the shells of buildings and the HVAC systems of buildings. I have a little bit different take on that. When we look at what happens in buildings, how we use energy, if you think of space heating, space cooling, ventilation, water, this is the building. This is how the building works. And computers, electronics, refrigeration, wet clean, that's sort of dishwashing and clothes washing. Cooking, water heating. We heat the water not for the buildings, but for us. So this amount is what we do in buildings. And lighting, well, that's somewhere in between. It's partly based upon what we do in buildings, and partly is to keep the buildings functioning. So I think about, of that 40% in buildings, sort of half is buildings, and about half is what we do in buildings. So that, again, what we do in the shape of the building is not something most of us can control, unless we make some major investments. What we do in buildings is something that we can control. So that if we think about carbon dioxide emissions, sort of a rule of thumb is the operations of residential and commercial buildings, about 20% of the energy of carbon dioxide we release. The activities we then tend to do in buildings is about 20%, transportation 33%, and industry 27%. And the type of interventions we might want to think about if we're worried about energy use is going to vary quite differently between all of these things. So there's not going to be any one silver bullet, because there's very different ways of that we end up using energy. If we look at the economic side of it, energy accounts for in the order of about 8%, 9% of our GDP. That is, our total expenditure on energy is about 9% of our GDP. But that counts not just the primary energy, but the cost for generating and distributing electricity is all included in this. One is what the economy spends, about $1.2 trillion, out of a $14 trillion economy. So the energy is significant, but it's not the overwhelming part of the overall economy. Buildings, about 3% of GDP, and in the order of 3% of personal income. Well, that sort of means, as you start thinking about it, that's a big number. But if you think about what 3 or 4% of your budget, it's probably not going to be your first priority. Half of our energy expenditure is oil on transportation, and you're spending in the order of 2.5 times as much on oil and transportation on the average as you use in energy in residential buildings. That leads to one of the first behavioral issue, is that you would expect as people are thinking about what to do actively, they may say that their energy use in transportation as they buy gasoline or as they buy airline tickets is something that they may want to pay more attention to than the electricity bill because it's a smaller fraction of their expenditure. So I want to now talk about, okay, with that background, energy efficiency, and I have a specific definition that I use because different people use this same phrase in very different ways. Some mean it to be, say, any way we reduce the use of energy, we'll call it energy efficient. Others say, well, if we reduce the use of energy but get the same physical services, that's energy efficient. The definition I want to use all the way along is reductions in energy use or energy use intensity that are economically efficient, that the benefits exceed the cost for doing the change. So that's what I mean by energy efficiency. And to bring the point home, I just think about things like decreased energy use and increased economic efficiency. It's two orthogonal concepts, two different axes. And so we can think of this upper corner as energy efficiency improvement. That is increased economic efficiency and decreased energy use. But there's also down here ways we use more energy that increase economic efficiency, and they're good. So my point of view will be it's good to move in that direction, but because of the externalities, it's particularly important to move in this upper direction, and that's the worst one that we don't want to deal with. So it's easy to draw a diagram like that. The question is, are there anything in those boxes? And I limited this to what I can put so that you can still read it here. And I've color-coded it because, again, when we're thinking about energy efficiency, again, there's a lot of different things that people talk about and often lump it all into the same category. I've taken the yellow as to be things for which there's good research opportunities and research is needed to move forward in that way. Take, for example, optimized building construction. There are some very good models that will tell you a mapping from how you design buildings to the energy use in the buildings once you've constructed it. Thousands of lines of code. Thousands of hours of research putting them together. The only small issue with them, if you then look at how the buildings actually perform afterwards, the error band extends up and down about 30 or 40% from the prediction. Well, that means that there's wonderful opportunities for computer science and building science to make better models so that you know that if you do something, if you want energy efficiency, you're going to get it. In fact, it turns out that most of those models have only some of the convective airflow in them, but do pretty well about other transfer mechanisms, but some heat transfer mechanisms just aren't in there. But what they especially don't do well about is knowing how people are going to use the buildings after they get in them. We have a building at Stanford we're very proud of, the Y2E2 building, the Yang and Yamazaki Environment and Engineering Building, and with a name like that, you can see why we call it Y2E2. It's meant to be very energy efficient. And it first turned out the performance was actually quite terrible. And then as they did a lot of checking, it turned out some of the controls were wired backwards. You laugh. This happens all the time. Buildings, some of the new designs of buildings are setting up the controls of the buildings so that the people responsible for the controlling building can't get to them. Because it turns out that given the training level that you have the controllers of the building, more often than not the human intervention reduces the performance of the building. We had in things like the Carnegie building at Stanford, which is, again, a global environment building, ecology building, very energy efficient. Turns out it wasn't working as well. And some of the environmentalists in there weren't happy with the heat flow. We were opening the windows so that the building was fighting against itself, cooling and heating simultaneously. So the models don't have human behavior very much in there. And so it's both the physical elements of it and the human side that need to be improved in here. Smart building controls, there's a lot of work, and some people are here in computer science and control. A lot of work in how do you optimize building controls by having sensors that have look-ahead behavior and can monitor the conditions in the building, can predict what the weather's going to be, and predict when people are going to be in there, and can observe how many people are there without violating the privacy of the people who are in that room in order to be able to have a sophisticated control. So those are examples of R&D. Smart meters is another one. That's the yellow. The light green is things where, in order to get these things, we probably need regulations. But these are regulations that are in principle are there, but have a lot more work to be done to fully implement. Like the reformed fuel efficiency standards that now have been set by the Obama administration. Appliance energy labeling, we label some of the appliances, but you go buy a television and look at a plasma television and an LED television, unless you really know how to read well raised numbers in black plastic, you'll not be able to tell anything about the difference in the energy use of those because the labeling just doesn't exist. Refrigerators are well labeled. The dark green are things that I think that we need to do, but we've done almost nothing so far, or other than talk about. And the white are the things that don't need any of the above. They're purely behavioral. Having energy audits in homes. And it turns out a lot of people get energy audits and never follow up on them. They're intimidated by what they're supposed to do. It's a behavioral choice. Light-emitting diodes, moving to task lighting, or moving all traffic lights to light-emitting diodes. The penetration of compact fluorescent behavior is human choices. Tire pressure. Obama said, you know, fill up your tires better, and some of the Republicans laughed at him. Well, actually, it makes about 10% difference in your fuel economy, keeping the right tire pressure on there. Programming thermostats. The one survey of programmable thermostats that was done showed that something like 60% of them had never been programmed. Okay, laugh. Any of you used to have a VCR? Did it flash 12 all the time? Why did it flash 12 all the time? Because you couldn't even figure out how to set the time on the thing. Well, most people, turn out, find setting a programmable thermostat intimidating. They don't do it. So is there a behavioral response? Actually, there is. Anybody recently buy a programmable thermostat? Okay, you probably would have noticed, lo and behold, it was pre-programmed for you. You may not like the programming, but it was warm in the morning when you get up, then it cools down in the day. Then it warms up when they guess you may be coming home from the work, and then it gets much colder in the night. That's an energy star pattern. So that's become the default option for those people who now buy a programmable thermostat. So if you don't program it, you get an Energy Star programming. It's just been a simple behavioral change that it doesn't take rocket science to recognize that if very few people program the thermostat, you give them the thermostat that's already programmed in the way you want it to be. So these are all behavioral issues. Enterprise management software. I'm on the board of directors of a little company called Hara that provides enterprise management software that allows companies to go in to trace their energy use across their whole enterprise. We have clients like News Corp and Coca-Cola and Apple and Cisco. They have lots of different facilities that you can use that makes it cheaper, much less costly to find energy cost problems. And therefore, to change your management procedures in your corporation to make it easier to find ways of reducing energy use. These are all behavioral, don't require any technology, regulations, and policy. Anyway, we have, though, things like the McKinsey curve, most of you have seen, that shows that the cost of reducing carbon dioxide, and these are positive, numbers up above are positive costs, and these are negative costs. Most of the negative costs, I have disagreements with a lot of their numbers here. However, not the basic concept that they're showing is there's commercial electronics, fuel economy of cars, commercial buildings, some industry, combined heat and power, residential buildings, lighting, residential electronics. Notice all the negative cost options are how we use energy. Positive cost options are distributed solar photovoltaics, active forest management, carbon capture and storage. Mostly the supply side options, the high cost and the demand side options are the negative costs. So you see that there, but you start wondering, well, is this a new phenomenon? Nah. If we drew this curve 20 years ago, it would have looked about the same. In fact, people have done this research 20 years ago. They just didn't display it this way, and they didn't have as good marketing skills as McKinsey does. But it would have looked about the same. So if there's all of these negative costs, low-hanging fruit, why aren't they being picked? There's a joke about the economist that's, he's walking with his son and sees a $20 bill. His son's going to pick it up. He says, no, son, don't touch that. If it was a real $20 bill, somebody else would have gotten it. Well, the fact is, I don't see any $20 bills in here because, in fact, people aren't getting them. Here we have $20 bills, actually much bigger than $20 bills, which is evidence that they exist and nobody's picking them up. Some sort of super glue must be holding it down there. And that's what I want to focus on, why those negative cost options continue. And I notice the time is moving faster. That clock must be defective. So I'll give you some incomplete explanations. And here's just a little table. There's a few things that are clear market failures. And I'm not going to spend as much time. I just want to talk briefly about that, and then more about the behavioral issues. These have been studied for a long time by economists, and economists pretty well understand some of these market behavior issues. Here's an area where there's a real opportunity for people in social psychology and anthropology and sociology and medical community health getting together with the physicists and engineers and computer sciences and economists and getting some actual solutions here. That's why I say this is going to be incomplete, because I'm going to share some of my ignorance with you on this. But let's go to first market failure, principal agent problems. I'll illustrate it with buildings. Rental versus owner-occupied buildings. These are all things that are energy efficient in my definition. The benefits of doing them exceed the cost. They reduce energy use. Insulated attic, you've got to be a num-dum not to insulate your attic in here. It doesn't cost very much. It saves you a lot. Owner-occupied homes, somewhere over 80%. Not 100, but somewhere over 80%. And this is all of California. There's some areas where it isn't important. Rental buildings, less than 40%. Insulated walls, almost 2-to-1 difference. Double pane windows, more than 3-to-1 difference. Programmable thermostat, 30% versus almost 60%. Landlords have different incentives than the tenants. Landlords pay the capital cost, tenants pay the rent. But that's an incomplete explanation. Because, in principle, the tenants can say, what's the building performance here? I'm not going to be willing to pay as much rent if it's a poor performance than good performance. But that's not happening. It's not enough to create the incentive. Why? Well, partly it's poor information. If anybody around here has ever tried to rent a home and say, well, while I'm about to rent it, I'd like to go and do an energy audit of your home and understand it so I can see how much rent is willing to pay. And they say, well, that's interesting. Let me answer this telephone call to tell this other person I'm going to rent it to them. Right now, our institutions don't facilitate that transfer of information. And frankly, most people who got that information would have trouble processing it and knowing what the economic consequences were. Behavioral issues. But look at over here. Compact fluorescent lights. It's not the landlord that changes your light bulb, it's you that changes it. Low flow shower head. Trivial to take out the shower head that the landlord put in and put in your own. Even that, there's a smaller difference, but a difference. I'm going to, the compact fluorescent, it's a little hassle to put in. Economically, it'll pay back in 2 or 3 years. I'm going to rent this apartment for a year. Why do I want to be helpful to the next person? Compact low flow shower heads, they say, well, I can save a little bit of money. And it'll be worth it over time, but the shower's not going to be as comfortable. And I don't want to go through the effort of going to the hardware store, buying a new shower head, putting it in for a little bit of savings. So even there's a split incentive problem. There's a difference between the landlord and the individuals. But it also illustrates one of the things that you see is that the default option is a very powerful in causing people to do things. Whatever is seen as a default, leaving in the old light bulbs, tends to govern behavior. And it also governs behavior for more than you would think. This is, there's some transactions cost. What we do find is in companies that have pension plans where you can, it's a defined contribution plan where companies will match your contribution. And they'll give it to you free up to a limit as part of your employment. Some companies had an opt-in that says, well, check this box if you would like to do different than the norm and have us contribute. Some had an opt-out system that said, well, if you don't check the box, we're going to match whatever you do, and it'll be a contribution to your to your retirement fund. More than a 2-to-1, there was in the order of, I don't remember the numbers, something like a 2-to-1 difference based upon opt-in versus opt-out. It's only checking a box. Whereas those who were sort of told that the norm is to not put the money into it, tended to not put the money in. At least for the first 3 years till they caught on, and then they all would get a change. The default option tends to matter an awful lot in what people do. This data, by the way, is nationwide. Similar sort of things for the nationwide difference. It's not just California that we see that. So let's talk about some other behavioral issues. One, it's often, I started out with a notion that the amount that you spend on energy is small enough that it's not worth the effort to try to optimize. And sometimes the transaction costs of optimizing are high. You know, you got to go to hardware to get the hardware store to get the programmable thermostat. I don't think that's the end of the story. One, we can think of a regulatory intervention if that was the case. But I want to tell you a little what-if story. I shop for my groceries at Safeway. And I go in there, and I can imagine a little bit different type of Safeway than I have. Or the Whole Foods Market, or whatever you all prefer. And being not a vegetarian, I may go to the steak place, and I could see filet mignon and chuck steak, flank steak, hamburger, and start buying it. But it's a little different because there's no price tags on anything. And in fact, if I think back, there's never been a price tag on any of the food that I've ever bought. Now imagine yourself as going to the shopper and that, and you're trying to decide between the filet mignon and the flank steak, and you know how they taste, but you don't see any price tags. And then you go fill up your cart, and they check it out, and they thank you. You still don't see anything. But at the end of the month, you get a bill that says groceries, $400. You probably wouldn't be the wisest shopper in the world. How is that different from how you buy your electricity? You flip the light switch, you buy your appliances, you turn on your computer. Nobody checks it out, but at the end of the month you get a bill that tells you what your electricity bill was going to be. So the first thing is, I think, and we think about the filet mignon, I could actually afford to buy that filet mignon. But actually, when I go in there, I'm more likely to buy the chuck steak or the flank steak. I can afford the difference. But small amounts matter. Now, I go into Safeway, and there's the generic Safeway brands and the national brand. I think it's about the same. I'm going to save 15 cents. I buy the Safeway brand. Maybe you do something like that too. So if you do, you say, actually, for small differences, we actually change little bits of behavior. We don't do that very much in electricity. First, I think because we don't know. Second, there's a cognitive issue, because if we said, well, this is going to save you 70 watts per hour, how many of you actually know what the bottom line difference is that to you? Well, you have to figure out what a watt is. I mean, you know enough about energy, you know what a watt is. But most people don't. And how that's related to a kilowatt and what the marginal price of electricity is. If you ever read your PG&E bill, you probably don't want to read it again. It's totally cryptic. It's very difficult to know what the marginal cost is for anything. Some researcher, one of the PhDs working with a guy by the name of Ito, working with Severin Borenstein here at Berkeley, has done a lot of just really nice empirical work showing, as far as I can see, nobody looks at the marginal price of electricity for their decision making. It's more consistent with looking at the average price. So most people actually don't know how to get the information. So that's sort of an important issue there. Let me just do a couple. Talk about the principal agent, the poor information, managerial priorities in companies. Most companies have an organizational structure that is not aligned to any of the various cost elements, including the energy cost elements. So nobody is usually responsible for reducing the cost, and those that are making the decisions in the company generally don't have the ability are not held accountable because it's part of the overhead. So even within corporations, managerial priorities have incentives that are inappropriate that lead to these problems. Information systems are bad. So question, I'm running out of time now, how to deal with it. Well, you probably are going to have to go beyond the economic motivations. Here's one illustration. I don't know if you can read it. Salesman saying it runs on its conventional gasoline-powered engine until it senses guilt, at which point it switches over to battery power. Actually, more than the economic issues, including the social norms and what things we feel guilty or not guilty about, make a lot of difference. Irrationalities, therefore, can matter. There's a wonderful little experiment Balaji Pravakar has done. He's a professor at Stanford in the electrical engineering department. And he's done work with Infosys in Bangalore, India. And people commute into work, terrible traffic jams at the peak load times. And Infosys wanted people to come in before the rush hour because they were better workers. So they decided they gave a stochastic reward. And people came in on the buses. So if you came on the bus, you got a bus ticket that said you were 1 hour in the hour before the rush hour, you'd get 1 raffle coupon. If you came in 2 hours earlier, you get 2 raffle coupons. And you get that every day you came in. And at the end of the month, there would be a drawing, and they'd give 1 month's salary. Woo! What's the expected value of 1 month when you have all of these people in Infosys in Bangalore? It was about $0.015. So the expected value of coming in earlier is 1.5 cents. But as you all said, wow, I'm on salary. Those of you who had wow probably didn't say, let me calculate the probability of that month's salary. You probably focused on the month's salary. If you offered people, said, come in an hour earlier than rush hour and we'll give you 1.5 cents, how many people would have responded? Zippo. They wouldn't even be willing to put in their bus token, their bus receipt for that 1.5 cents. Somewhere over 15% of the workers there moved either 1 or 2 hours earlier while the experiment was going on. As soon as the experiment stopped, it went back down to what they had before. So Infosys is now extending that to all of their facilities. Anybody who can do the math says, well, you got to look at expected value. Probability of the outcome times the consequence. Yet what we find is what motivates human behavior is stochastic rewards are more powerful than deterministic rewards of the same expected value. And if that weren't true, you wouldn't have lotteries in states. Lotteries are bad things for your own economics, but people do those. And there's all of these coupons, all of these marketing things say you do this and you get one chance to win $5,000. And there's 20 million people doing it. I mean, the expected value is nothing. Stochastic rewards. Social norms. We find that providing billing information to people on their electricity that says where they are relative to their neighbors matters. If they're above the neighbors, use more, they tend to reduce their use. If they're below, they either do nothing or increase their use. If you give them feedback, and we're testing this, gives them information. Anybody who's driven the Prius and look at that energy meeting, know it's very motivational. So I want to, because I've really run out of time and people are leaving, just say it's not just we sort of academics. These principles are being used by the Navy now in some of their officer housing. as they're sort of structuring the system. So feedback, analogies applies to us. And I'm going to just stop now with just 3 analogies. Another very low salience issue is smoking. We were a nation of smokers, now we're mostly a nation of non-smokers. We did it through a lot of behavioral as well as economic issues. Take, for example, the movie placements. When I was growing up, everybody sophisticated in movies smoked. Now in movies, people do smoke, but they're only the bad guys. Good guys don't smoke in movies, only bad guys. There's messages that are going in here. We have all sorts of messages. Coming out recently in work on obesity is finding in communities where all the other people are somewhat obese, the teenagers growing up are now adopting their body image to being obese is right. And that's making it harder for the public health community to deal with obesity. So the point is, I just want to leave you with, as I said, it's completely very incomplete, but I wanted to suggest that there's really opportunities for the social sciences, the economics, the physical sciences to be put together if we want to be dealing with energy use. So I'm going to stop at that point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Great talk. Let's open the floor for questions. Okay.
Yes. Oh.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about the Jevons paradox and macroeconomic rebound effect associated with energy efficiency. I'm wondering if you're a subscriber to it, and if so, what we can do about it.
Okay, let me give what the key issue is. There's a notion. This notion's been around at least for 30 years or so, and the fact is that if you make something more energy efficient, it's cheaper to use, and so people use more of it. And that's the rebound effect. Yeah, just like if you increase the price of something, makes it more costly, people use less. The issue is quantitatively. How big an effect is that? And what we've known all the time at the micro level is that quantitative effect, on the average, is probably in the order of 20% take back. Think of fuel. When you make automobiles more fuel efficient, it's cheaper to drive. People drive more. The elasticity of demand with respect to gasoline price is in the order of 0.2 in the short run. That's the same elasticity with respect to efficiency. It would be the negative of that. So therefore, if you make cars 10% more efficient, then people drive 2% more. On the net, you get 8% gain and you lose it. So at the micro level, it tends to be small. There's recently a report by the Breakthrough Institute, and I don't know what their motivations are, but it's saying, for most of the time, if you get energy efficient, you'll use more energy. That, I think, is just dead wrong. Sometimes you will. There are some things whose demand elasticity is so high that if the price goes down, you'll spend more because you use so much more. For those, the rebound effect would be greater than 1. It would take back. That would be a tiny set of things, but if we go back to way back at the beginning and look at how we spend on energy, take this as example. This says under the operation stop, it says transportation. That we have almost no substitute. That's a 20% effect. Some of these may be larger, and it's in some of the industrial processes that people think there may be a larger effect. Now, the second thing is there's been a whole group that people are saying there's a macroeconomic effect. If we use less energy, it's more efficient. It's like we're getting richer. If we're richer, we spend more, and that uses more energy. Yes, but energy is only about the primary energy is only 8% of their economy. So if you reduce your energy cost by 20% of the energy cost, that's 20% of 8% or 1.6%. You're richer by 1.6%. You use everything 1.6% more, and your energy use goes up 1.6%. So you reduced it 20%, it goes up 1.6 to compensate. So it exists, but it's small. That's what the current debate's going on, is it exists or is small. My point of view is, any way we look at it, the micro effect in some cases is large, but in almost all cases is small. The macro effect is always has to be small. Okay? But you're going to hear more about that. Nature just had an article about that. Breakthrough Institute having, and there's other. It's in the blogosphere right now.
Questions? Okay.
Anyway, I went too long, but thank you.